Washington just got schooled by its own neighbor, not with threats, not with sanctions, with a spreadsheet. And the numbers Canada's ambassador laid out in front of American officials were so damaging to the White House's own narrative that the room reportedly went quiet. If you've been told Canada is the one bleeding in this trade war, stay with me, because the data tells a completely different story. Drop a comment right now. Do you think American auto workers are being protected by these tariffs or quietly sacrificed? Let's find out together. First, understand who delivered this reality check. Mark Wiseman isn't a career diplomat trained to smile and say nothing. He ran the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board when it managed over $500 billion. He then joined BlackRock, the largest asset manager on the planet, overseeing trillions in global investments. Prime Minister Mark Carney, himself a former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, handpicked Wiseman personally in December 2025 to represent Canada in Washington. Think about what that choice signals. When Canada needed someone to sit across from the Trump trade team during the most economically consequential negotiations in decades, Ottawa didn't send a politician. They sent a man who speaks the language of capital, risk, and long-term consequence fluently. That is not a country panicking. That is a country that came prepared. In May 2026, Wiseman addressed a gathering of trade officials, legal minds, and policy experts at Johns Hopkins University's Washington facility. And he said something few diplomats ever say out loud. Trump's Section 232 tariffs, the 25% duties placed on Canadian cars and auto components, aren't just hurting Canada. In his own words, they are shutting down the primary export market for American-made vehicles. Let that land for a second. Canada was, until recently, the single largest foreign buyer of U.S.-built cars. Not Germany, not Japan, not China, Canada. The country that shares a 5,500-mile border with the United States. The country whose economy is so deeply woven into America's that a single car engine can cross the border 7 or 8 times during assembly before the finished vehicle ever reaches a dealership. Wiseman's message to Washington was surgical and simple. You think you're targeting us, you are actually targeting yourselves. And here's what most analysts are still not talking about. The damage isn't coming, it's already here. We break this down every day because these numbers move fast. So if you want to stay ahead, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Now consider the size of what's at stake. The American auto industry contributes $1.2 trillion annually to the U.S. economy, roughly 5% of GDP. It supports 10.1 million American jobs across factories, parts suppliers, dealership networks, logistics chains, and steel producers. For perspective, the entire U.S. military counts approximately 2.8 million people in active and reserve roles. The auto sector supports more than 3 times that number. This is not a niche industry. This is a structural pillar of the American economy. And it is under stress right now, not from foreign competition alone, but from the compounding effect of tariffs applied to a production system that was never designed to be taxed at the border. Because here's the thing most people fundamentally misunderstand about North American auto manufacturing. This is not Canada building a finished car and shipping it south. A single vehicle is partially assembled, crosses the border, has components added, crosses again, and repeats that process sometimes 8 times before completion. A circuit board in a car seat might cross the US-Canada line 4 times. An engine block 5. Every one of those crossings under a 25% tariff adds cost. And those costs don't add up linearly. They multiply. Analysts estimate that tariff-driven expenses could push the average price of a new American car up by roughly $3,000. For trucks and SUVs, the highest-selling segments in the country, the projected increase tops $10,000 per vehicle. Who absorbs that? American buyers. Every single time. The projected consequence is a drop of 1.5 to 2 million vehicles in annual U.S. sales for as long as these tariffs remain in place. In a market that typically moves 15 to 16 million new vehicles per year, that is a 13% collapse in volume, in a sector with razor-thin margins and enormous fixed costs. The lost employment, reduced tax revenue, and gutted factory towns that follow would far exceed any tariff revenue Washington collects. And the hardest-hit states aren't blue coastal ones. They're Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, the exact communities the tariffs were framed to protect. But here is where the story shifts from painful to genuinely alarming, and most coverage hasn't caught up to this yet. Canada is not sitting still. Ottawa isn't issuing statements and hoping Washington softens. It is quietly, methodically restructuring its economic relationships. In January 2026, Prime Minister Carney flew to Beijing and sat down with President Xi Jinping at the Great Hall of the People. What came out of that meeting shook boardrooms in Detroit and offices in Washington. Canada reduced its tariff on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to 6.1% for an initial annual quota of 49,000 units, a cap set to rise to 70,000 by 2031. In exchange, China slashed its tariff on Canadian canola oil from 84% to around 15%. On the surface, that looks like a farm for vehicles trade. It is far more than that. Canada just told Washington what no ally wants to say directly. If you close your market to us, we will build new ones. And we already have. The reaction in Washington was immediate. A Democratic congressman from Michigan stated publicly that the deal threatens American workers and producers. The head of the American EV Jobs Alliance was even more direct, saying, and these are his words, China just gained a foothold in the North American EV market, and it did not happen by accident. He then added something that cuts to the core of this entire crisis. When U.S. trade policy becomes chaotic, unpredictable, and destructive, bad outcomes are inevitable. That criticism came from an American industry voice aimed squarely at American policy. Not Canadian spin, not foreign pressure. A domestic industry leader warning Washington that its own decisions created this opening for Beijing. Here's the part that carries the longest shadow. The Canada-China agreement doesn't just allow Chinese EV sales. It requires Chinese manufacturers to establish joint ventures for vehicle or battery production inside Canada within 3 years. That means Chinese battery technology, Chinese capital, and Chinese manufacturing infrastructure will be embedded on America's northern border, inside the same economic zone as Michigan, built to North American safety and emissions standards, producing vehicles that are legally and technically compatible with the U.S. market. A Michigan senator and former CIA officer raised this directly at an event in Toronto in May 2026, warning that Chinese EVs could transmit 3D video and precise location data back to Beijing. She framed it as both an economic and a national security threat. She's right on both counts. And here's the structural problem no one wants to say plainly. A vehicle assembled in Windsor, Ontario through a Chinese-Canadian manufacturing partnership is legally different from one imported from Shanghai. Once those factories exist, any ban becomes exponentially harder to enforce. Now layer onto all of this a hard deadline that is approaching fast. July 1st, 2026. That is the date embedded in the CUSMA agreement, the pact that replaced NAFTA, by which all 3 nations must signal either renewal or withdrawal. As of now, there is no renewal framework. No scheduled negotiations between Canada and the United States. Wiseman told Canadian lawmakers in April 2026 that he could not predict when formal talks might begin. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer has presented a list of demands: changes to Canada's dairy supply management, removal of provincial restrictions on American alcohol, adjustments to Canadian digital content rules that read less like a negotiating foundation and more like a political wish list. These aren't tweaks. They touch the core of Canadian domestic policy. And the gap between what Washington is asking for and what Ottawa can politically deliver is not small. The economic consequences of prolonged uncertainty are already materializing, and they don't wait for a formal breakdown. When General Motors quietly cut jobs at its Factory Zero facility in Detroit, that wasn't a Canadian problem. When Stellantis pulled back commitments in Windsor, it disrupted a supply web that feeds directly into Ohio and Indiana. When Ford revived its Oakville plant for Super Duty trucks, it reflected caution rather than confidence, a company hedging, not expanding. Smaller parts suppliers, the tool and die shops, the component fabricators, the precision manufacturers running on thin margins are in worse shape. One Windsor area supplier serving both U.S. and Canadian automakers reported nearly a 70% drop in sales following tariff increases. A 70% revenue collapse does not reverse when a tariff eases. It forces a company to restructure entirely, pivot to new industries, or close. Scale that across hundreds of similar operations throughout Ontario, Quebec, and the Great Lakes corridor, and the real depth of the damage becomes visible. Here is what makes this moment particularly telling. Canada arrived at this confrontation better positioned than the White House expected. Mark Carney doesn't face a November election. He is not managing for short-term optics. He is managing for durable outcomes. Canada met NATO's 2% GDP defense target 6 years ahead of schedule and is on track for 5%, which eliminated Washington's most reliable leverage point. Canada supplies aluminum used in U.S. fighter aircraft, tungsten for armor-piercing rounds, and critical minerals foundational to American defense manufacturing. These aren't negotiating chips Canada invented. They're geographic and geological realities. Wiseman, for his part, walked into Washington not to plead and not to threaten. He presented data, calmly, precisely, in the language of institutional finance, showing that the tariff architecture is causing measurable harm to the country that built it. That is not the posture of a nation in retreat. So who is actually winning this trade conflict? Honestly, no one. Not without cost. But the costs are distributed unevenly and in ways that were not advertised. The United States began with structural leverage. Around 75% of Canadian exports flow to the American market. That dependency is real and deep, but leverage is only effective if the party wielding it can absorb the cost of doing so. And the Section 232 auto tariffs are extracting a price from American consumers, American factory towns, and American industry that was never part of the public sales pitch. Canada faces steeper short-term economic pain. Growth forecasts for 2026 fell to 1.1%. Insolvencies hit a 17-year high early in the year. The strain is genuine. But Canada's strategic position has quietly strengthened. New trade relationships with China, NATO obligations met, an ambassador with a sovereign wealth fund background who can read a balance sheet better than most of the officials he's negotiating with, and a prime minister with no political incentive to rush a bad deal. The hard truth, the one that gets buried under daily tariff headlines, is that some of the damage already done cannot be undone by any agreement. When an automaker cancels an EV investment in Canada, that decision doesn't reverse on the day tariffs lift. Multi-billion-dollar industrial commitments involve supply chain redesigns, retraining programs, retooled production lines, and long-term contractor relationships. One engineering professor with deep knowledge of Canada's auto sector said it plainly. Even if this flare-up settles and tariffs disappear tomorrow, the long-term damage is already done. The ongoing threat of tariffs has permanently cooled investment decisions on both sides of the border. That cooling effect is real. It shows up in canceled projects, postponed hiring, and capital that quietly moved to more predictable jurisdictions. It doesn't appear in tariff revenue figures, but it compounds every month without resolution. What a genuine resolution requires isn't complicated to identify. It's just politically difficult to deliver. The Section 232 auto tariffs need to be removed or fundamentally restructured, not because Canada demands it, but because a $1.2 trillion industry cannot sustain a cost that multiplies across 8 border crossings per vehicle. CUSMA needs renewal with terms stable enough that manufacturers will actually commit capital to North American production again. The Chinese EV situation needs to be addressed as a consequence of the breakdown, rather than blamed on Canada. Because Ottawa went to Beijing after Washington made the North American market hostile, not before. And above all, the negotiating atmosphere needs to shift from public posturing to the kind of direct, technical work that Wiseman described to Canadian lawmakers as courteous, candid, and constructive. That diplomatic language carries weight. It means the real conversations are happening below the noise. Whether they move fast enough matters enormously. The bottom line is this: Trump's tariff strategy was designed around a specific assumption, that Canada's dependence on the U.S. market would force rapid political capitulation. That assumption was wrong. Canada showed up with the right people, a long-term mindset, alternative relationships already in motion, and an ambassador who walked into Washington and delivered the most damaging critique of these tariffs, using nothing but American economic data. The $1.2 trillion U.S. auto sector is not broken, but it is under pressure that is building faster than most public commentary acknowledges. And every month without resolution is a month of permanent damage that no future deal fully repairs. If this gave you clarity on what's actually happening beneath the trade war headlines, the financial architecture, the strategic positioning, the real cost distribution, then you already know this is the kind of analysis worth having in your feed every single day. Comment below. Do you think a CUSMA deal gets done before July 1st? And can the American auto sector hold together long enough for that to happen? I read every comment. Let's think through this together. And if you want the follow-up, what Chinese EV manufacturing on America's northern border actually means for U.S. automakers over the next decade, it's already being prepared. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it when it drops.